Irene is the purest saint in the circle. This phrase has circulated in the socialite circle for 6 years, because after 3 years of marriage to the legal world's unattainable flower, Calvin, she remains untouched to this day. Calvin has misophobia, severe to an outrageous degree, dating for 3 years. Married for 3 years, he refused all physical contact, no hugs, no kisses, and certainly no intimacy. She thought this was just Calvin, aloof and noble, untouched by worldly desires. But only today did she realize, the unattainable flower could descend to the mortal world, and his fastidiousness could have exceptions. In the upscale restaurant, Irene's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her glass. Through the window, she saw clearly that Calvin was kneeling on one knee, massaging the sore ankle of the woman opposite him. His slender fingers cradled that pale ankle with such gentleness, as if holding a treasure, his face showing not a trace of disgust or discomfort. Was this really the same Calvin who would sanitize his hands 3 times after accidentally brushing against hers? Irene trembled as she took the photo and sent it to Calvin's best friend. "Who is she?" The friend quickly replied. "How do you know Joanna?" "Joanna." Irene stared fixedly at the name. "So, who is she?" After hesitating for a moment, the brother finally confessed, "Calvin's first love." "Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Subscribe us to read wonderful novels every day." Now the story begins. Back then, he gave up inheriting the family business to become a lawyer for her, got into fights with thugs and hospitalized for her, nearly losing half his life. After the breakup, he was depressed for 2 whole years before moving on. Irene listened quietly, her mind blank. The brother comforted her. "That's all in the past. He married you now, so he must love you. Is that so?" Irene laughed until tears welled up in her eyes. She still remembered that sophomore year when she first saw Calvin at a university. He stood at the entrance of the law school, his white shirt fluttering in the wind, as cool and detached as an ink-wash painting. As the eldest daughter of the Burton family, she was radiant and bold, accustomed to getting whatever she wanted since childhood. But that day, when her request for contact information was refused, she learned for the first time that there were things in this world even she couldn't obtain, so she began a relentless pursuit that lasted 2 years. Every day she'd stake out his place with breakfast, only for him to toss it straight into the trash. The carefully chosen gifts she prepared were handed without a glance to stray dogs on the street. Even the sleeve she accidentally brushed against would be immediately removed and discarded on the spot, yet she grew more determined with each setback, refusing to give up. Then one rainy night, as she stood drenched at the library entrance, Calvin unexpectedly handed her an umbrella. "Try it," he said, his voice as cold as ice. She thought she had one. After all, he finally became her boyfriend, and later, her husband. Yet after 3 years of dating and 3 years of marriage, he would still wash his hands 3 times with disinfectant if he accidentally touched her. She wanted a hug. He stepped back. She leaned in for a kiss. He dodged. On their wedding night, he slept in the study. Everyone said, "Calvin is just like that. He has severe misophobia." Irene gradually came to accept this explanation. After all, he treated everyone the same way, didn't he? Yet today, of all days, she had to witness him kneeling on one knee to massage another woman's ankle, his gaze so tender it was unbearable. Of all things, she had to realize with painful clarity that someone could indeed be an exception in his heart. How laughable. Irene had beauty that turned heads and a figure to die for. Her suitors could line up from the south of the city to the north. For a man who didn't love her, she humbled herself for 8 long years. If he wouldn't touch her, there were plenty who would. If he wouldn't love her, there were plenty who would. In that case, she would divorce him, completely freeing him to be with his true love. Having made up her mind, Irene wiped away her tears, grabbed her bag, and hurried out of the restaurant. In her haste, she accidentally bumped into Joanna, who was just about to leave. The moment their eyes met, the overhead sign suddenly came loose and came crashing down toward them. Irene instinctively pushed Joanna away, but the heavy sign struck her own back, leaving her instantly drenched in blood. The excruciating pain sent her to her knees, and through blurred vision, she saw Calvin sprinting from the parking lot. He immediately helped Joanna up, anxiously checking her injuries. Not caring that his expensive suit was covered in dust, only after confirming Joanna was unharmed did he notice Irene lying in a pool of blood. "What are you doing here?" Calvin shielded Joanna behind him, his gaze icy and sharp. "You even stalk me when I meet friends." Irene was in too much pain to speak, feeling her heart ache more than the wound itself. "No, when the billboard fell just now, it was this young lady who saved me." Joanna finally snapped back to reality and remembered to explain. Calvin paused slightly before turning to look at Irene. "You two know each other?" Joanna asked cautiously. Irene was in too much pain to speak, and could only watch as Calvin's expression shifted. "Well, she's one of my admirers," Calvin said indifferently. his gaze sweeping over Irene's pale face. "She's been pestering me for a long time." These words were like a knife, stabbing straight into Irene's heart. She suddenly laughed, tears mingling with blood as they fell. 8 years of relationship, and in his words, she was just a pursuer. Joanna saw Irene lying in a pool of blood and said worriedly, "Calvin, carry her to the hospital, she's too badly injured." Calvin remained motionless, his voice icy. "She's covered in blood, it's filthy. I have mysophobia, I can't touch her." "Just call an ambulance," he said. Irene lay on the cold ground, blood oozing from her forehead, making her face appear even paler, hearing Calvin's words. Her heart felt as if gripped by an invisible hand, the pain so intense it nearly suffocated her. The wail of an ambulance siren grew louder, drawing nearer. The medical staff rushed over and were just about to lift Irene onto the stretcher when Joanna suddenly swayed, her face instantly turning pale. "Calvin, I..." Before she could finish her sentence, darkness clouded her vision, and she collapsed limply. "Joanna." Calvin darted forward in a flash, catching her firmly in his arms. His usually cool voice carried panic for the first time as he sharply looked up and coldly ordered the medical staff, "Put her down, take Joanna to the hospital first." The nurse looked troubled. "But Ms. Irene has lost too much blood and is already unconscious. If we wait for the next ambulance, her life might be in danger." "I called this ambulance," Calvin coldly interrupted, carefully placing Joanna on the stretcher, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I decide who gets on." With that, he boarded the ambulance without looking back, never once glancing at Irene. Irene watched the ambulance drive away, her heart numb with pain, until she finally collapsed unconscious. Irene woke up to a blinding white light that made her squint uncomfortably. "You're finally awake." The nurse sighed in relief. "A kind passerby brought you to the hospital. Do you need to notify your family to come take care of you?" Irene shook her head weakly, her voice faint. "No need, I'm single." The nurse looked surprised. "But the records show you've been married for 3 years, with a husband but no children." "We'll be divorced soon." Her voice was soft, yet resolute. As the words fell, the hospital room door swung open. "Divorce?" Calvin walked in with a cold expression. "Who's getting divorced?" "It's a friend of mine who's getting divorced." Irene lied without batting an eye, her fingertips secretly clutching the corner of the bedsheet. Calvin nodded indifferently. "You can come to me. I'll take on her case pro bono. No need for such trouble." She tugged at her lips, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Both parties are willing to divorce. Just draft an agreement for us." Calvin suspected nothing and raised his hand to signal his assistant to prepare it. The air in the hospital room became suffocatingly still after the door closed. "Yesterday, Joanna and I were just catching up as old friends." Calvin suddenly spoke up. "Don't overthink it, and don't go causing trouble for her." Irene suddenly laughed. She was spoiled and willful, but never unreasonable. If he had been honest about having someone in his heart from the start, she would never have clung to him for so many years. A sharp, needle-like pain spread through her chest. Suppressing her emotions, she raised her eyes to meet his gaze. "Did you come just to say this?" And also, his tone softened slightly. "Thank you for saving Joanna. She has a coagulation disorder. Getting injured would be very troublesome for her. As compensation, you can make any request you'd like." Irene stared fixedly at him. "Do you love her that much? Enough to compensate your wife for her sake?" Calvin didn't catch it clearly and slightly frowned. "What?" Just then, the assistant pushed the door open and handed the drafted divorce agreement to Irene. She took it in silence, flipped directly to the husband's signature section, and pushed it toward Calvin. "Sign it." "You're mistaken." His slender fingers hovered above the page. "This is the husband's signature line for the divorce. As the lawyer, I should be signing the witness page." He was about to turn the page when his phone rang abruptly. The name Joanna glared painfully on the screen. "Turn to the next page," he instructed Irene, then turned away to answer the call, his voice instantly softening. "What's wrong?" Irene remained motionless, the pen tip still pressed against the same spot. "All right, I'll be right there." After hanging up, Calvin signed without even looking. The moment the pen touched paper, Irene's suspended heart finally plunged into an icy abyss. "I have an emergency at the law firm. I need to go." His retreating figure was so resolute. He didn't even notice he'd signed in the wrong place. Irene watched him leave, her hand trembling as she signed her name in the other column. Once the 30-day divorce cooling-off period ended, they would be strangers to each other. During the week in the hospital, Irene's bedside remained empty. She learned to change her own dressings, grit her teeth through the pain to turn over, and keep watch on the drip to call the nurse. It wasn't until the day of discharge that Calvin finally arrived. Fashionably late. "I've been working overtime lately," he said, standing at the doorway in his crisp suit, carrying the faintest hint of jasmine fragrance. That was the scent of perfume Joanna wore that day. Irene lowered her eyes to pack her luggage. choosing not to expose his lie. To her surprise, Calvin didn't take her home directly but instead brought her to the newly opened shopping mall. "What would you like to eat?" Standing in the elevator, his slender fingers swiped across the phone screen as he asked with rare patience. "The shrimp dumplings at this Cantonese restaurant are quite authentic. From lunch to the movies." He arranged every detail meticulously. He would pull out her chair before she sat down, remind her to be careful of the hot soup when she drank it, and drape his suit jacket over her shoulders when the cinema's air conditioning was too strong. "Is the air conditioning too cold for you? Is the seat comfortable? Does this dish suit your taste?" This kind of thoughtfulness made Irene dazed. 8 years had passed, and this was their first date like an ordinary couple. "Aren't you a neat freak who hates crowded places the most?" She finally couldn't help but ask in the dim light of the cinema. Calvin paused while adjusting his cuffs. "You've been cooped up for too long. I'll make an exception just this once." His voice was gentle, so gentle it didn't sound like Calvin at all. This sense of dissonance peaked when he took her home but claimed he needed to return to the law firm to work overtime. Irene found herself inexplicably hailing a cab to follow him. The shopping mall was brightly lit under the night sky. She saw Calvin pick up Joanna and take her along the same route they'd followed during the day. The same restaurant, the same movie theater, even buying the exact same dress from the same store. "It's been so long since I came back. I don't recognize anything anymore." Joanna clung to his arm coquettishly. "Good thing I have you to accompany me." She suddenly tilted her head. "But I remember you used to hate shopping the most. You'd go out of your way to avoid malls. How come you now know exactly which store has the springiest shrimp dumplings, which theater has the most comfortable seats, and which shop carries dresses that suit me best? Don't tell me you secretly did your homework, Span." Calvin wore an indifferent expression, the man who usually recoiled from others' touch as if it were filth, yet the moment Joanna turned to try on clothes, he effortlessly took the handbag she handed him. Doing homework." Through the shop window, Irene felt her heart constrict violently, as if pierced by an ice pick. Each beat tore at her flesh, making even breathing an excruciating torment. So she was just a tool he used to please his white moonlight. Trembling all over, she turned to flee. But Joanna spotted her with sharp eyes. Irene." Joanna widened her eyes in surprise, her voice sweet to the point of being piercing. "What a coincidence. I didn't expect to meet you here. By the way, how's your injury? I was planning to visit you in the hospital, but recently I've been so..." Before she could finish her sentence, her phone suddenly rang. Joanna smiled apologetically and stepped aside to take the call. Calvin's face darkened instantly. "Are you following me again?" he whispered, his gaze sharp as a knife. "I told you, Joanna and I are just friends. Stop being so paranoid all the time." Irene looked at the man she had loved for 8 years and suddenly smiled. "Calvin, you're doing great. I don't care what your relationship is." Her voice was soft, yet every word was clear. "You have physical fastidiousness, and I have emotional fastidiousness. All these years, I've respected your habits, but I also hope you can respect me, at the very least, by being honest with me." Calvin frowned tightly. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Irene was about to speak when a sharp fire alarm suddenly pierced the air. "Fire, run!" The crowd erupted into chaos instantly, with thick smoke surging in from all directions like a tidal wave. Calvin and Irene were separated by the panicked crowd, finding themselves meters apart in the blink of an eye. Irene struggled to steady herself and retreat, but was violently shoved from behind. She fell heavily to the ground, the back of her head striking the cold marble floor as darkness clouded her vision. Excruciating pain shot through her back as countless feet trampled over her, ribs feeling crushed, palms mangled into a bloody mess. She struggled to get up, only to be shoved back down. Through blurred vision, she saw Calvin desperately pushing through the crowd. For a fleeting moment, she thought he was coming to save her, but the next second, Joanna. Calvin ran toward the distant Joanna without looking back. She watched helplessly as he pulled Joanna into his arms, shielding her from the jostling crowd with his own body. Irene lay on the cold floor, her eyes red as she stared at their retreating figures. Her ribs might be broken. Every breath carried the metallic taste of blood, but compared to the physical pain, the feeling of her heart being torn apart left her even more suffocated. The smoke grew thicker, the flames painting the entire mall in a crimson glow. Irene's consciousness gradually faded until she completely blacked out. Irene woke up to a searing pain coursing through her entire body. Irene, you have extensive burns across your body. We need to assemble multiple doctors to begin surgery immediately. The physician said gravely, otherwise, at best you'll be disfigured, at worst you'll suffer organ failure. She struggled to sit up, her voice hoarse as she commanded, book out the entire hospital, mobilize all medical resources. The medical team sprang into action. But just as she was being wheeled toward the operating room, the sound of an argument suddenly erupted from the far end of the corridor. What do you mean the hospital's been booked out? The voice made Irene freeze completely. Through the gaps of the hospital bed, she saw Calvin holding the unconscious Joanna, confronting the medical staff. Yes, Mr. Calvin, today the hospital is only serving one critically ill patient. My girlfriend was in a car accident, she must have surgery today. Calvin's voice was icy. A public hospital being bribed to concentrate resources on one person is a serious violation of the law. He abruptly flashed his lawyer's badge, the metal emblem gleaming coldly under the lights. Either admit her immediately, or prepare for court. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances, who hadn't heard of the undefeated reputation of golden lawyer Calvin. 5 minutes later, Irene's surgery was cancelled. We're sorry, Ms. Irene. The chief physician stood guiltily by her bedside. Mr. Calvin threatened to expose the hospital if we refused treatment, with limited doctors available and your procedure requiring multiple senior specialists. We must wait until that young lady's surgery concludes. Irene lay on the gurney, the searing pain throughout her body paling in comparison to the agony of her heart being torn apart. She watched helplessly as Calvin anxiously waited outside Joanna's operating room. He kept checking his watch, pacing back and forth, even stopping every passing nurse to demand updates. Even the most unattainable flower will eventually fall from its divine pedestal. The one who made him willingly fall was never her. Not until Joanna's surgery was completed was Irene wheeled into the operating room. When she awoke, the wound on her back burned with a searing pain. Ms. Irene, I regret to inform you, the doctor hesitated. Due to the surgical delay, the burns on your back will leave permanent scars. If you're concerned about your husband's opinion, you might consider cosmetic repair surgery. Irene gave a faint smile that tugged at her facial wounds. No need. My husband never touches me, he won't care about these scars. She paused, her gaze terrifyingly calm. Besides, he won't be my husband for much longer. The hospital room door suddenly swung open. What do you mean by that? Calvin stood at the doorway, his brows tightly furrowed. The doctor tactfully exited, gently closing the door behind him. Irene wearily closed her eyes, unwilling to speak. Calvin's gaze finally settled on her bandage-wrapped body, his tone uncharacteristically softened. That day, I thought you'd evacuated safely from the mall. His Adam's apple bobbed. I didn't realize you were hurt this badly. I came to see you as soon as I heard the news. Irene opened her eyes and looked at him calmly. It's fine, I'm used to it. Her voice carried not a single ripple of emotion. After all, you were never there when I needed you most these past years. One more time won't make a difference. Calvin's frown deepened, after a moment of silence. He pulled out a black card from his inner suit pocket. This is compensation. She didn't take the card, just calmly met his gaze. I want 50 million. Wired now. Calvin was visibly taken aback, as if he hadn't expected her to ask for so much at once, but he didn't ask further. He simply hummed an acknowledgement, and as he operated his mobile banking app, he asked in a cool tone, "What happened to you?" Irene was about to speak when Calvin's phone suddenly rang. Joanna. His voice instantly softened. Okay, I'll be right there. After transferring the money, he hastily put away his phone. I'll come see you later. Irene watched his retreating figure and said softly, consider this money as part of the divorce settlement. When the divorce papers come through, her voice was quiet yet each word was clear. We'll be even. Irene's first task after being discharged from the hospital was to sort through all the items related to Calvin, in the study. She opened the long dusty storage cabinet, where the gifts she had given him over the years were neatly arranged, an unopened limited edition fountain pen, custom cufflinks still in their pristine packaging, a cashmere scarf with its tag still attached. Take them all away, she softly instructed the servants. Burn what's useless, and divide what's usable among yourselves. The servants, delighted, held these valuable items with gratitude, repeatedly thanking her. In the evening, Calvin returned home just in time to see the butler carefully polishing the Mont Blanc pen he had never used. What's going on here? He asked with a frown. The butler replied nervously, Madam gave it to us as a reward. Calvin felt a strange unease pass through his heart. He quickly went upstairs, pushed open the bedroom door, and saw Irene organizing the wardrobe. Why did you give my things away? He demanded in a low voice. Irene didn't look up, her tone calm. You never use them anyway, they just gather dust. Better to give them to someone who needs them, make the most of their usefulness. Calvin stared at her profile, feeling she was somehow different, yet unable to pinpoint exactly what had changed, until he returned to the study and discovered that sandalwood box was missing. It was Joanna's gift to him, a pair of sapphire cufflinks he had always kept hidden in the depths of the drawer. Irene, he stormed into the bedroom with a cold expression, his face terrifyingly dark. Give me back my cufflinks. Irene looked up, her brow slightly furrowed. What cufflinks? Calvin darkened his face as he pulled up his phone gallery. This one, who did you give it to? Find it within an hour, or face the consequences. Irene stared at the photo for 3 seconds and immediately knew the only thing that could make him lose control like this must be related to Joanna. She was certain she hadn't taken that box, but still, fearing oversight, she began searching through the villa. Surprisingly, Calvin started looking for it too. The man with severe misophonia now had his suit covered in dust, his expensive leather shoes stepping into piles of garbage, his slender fingers rummaging through filthy plastic bags. Irene stood aside, suddenly finding it hard to breathe. After 6 years of marriage, this was the first time she'd seen him degrade himself like this for something. So Joanna's gift was worth this to him. After a fruitless night of searching, Calvin was at his breaking point. Dawn was approaching, and the entire villa had been turned upside down in disarray. Calvin's white shirt clung to him in wrinkled disarray, his sweat-dampened bangs plastered to his forehead. And those always elegantly groomed hands were now smeared with grime and bloodstains. Completely losing control, he strode into the bedroom and snatched the jade bracelet from the dressing table, the one Irene's grandmother had given her on her deathbed. Last time I'm asking, he rasped, where are my cufflinks? I told you I didn't take them. Irene stared at her in disbelief, voice trembling and eyes burning. Give me back my bracelet, since you refuse to hand them over. You can forget about keeping this bracelet either. Thud, the jade bracelet shattered into 3 pieces, bouncing twice on the floor. She knelt on the ground, suddenly unable to breathe. Do you care so much about what she gave you? Her voice choked with sobs. Enough to smash my grandmother's heirloom. Calvin looked at her coldly. What I care about is that you touched what's mine. This is the price you must pay. Irene felt her heart ache so intensely she could barely breathe. Yet suddenly burst into laughter. As she laughed, tears began streaming uncontrollably down her face. Calvin, she nearly shouted, you know perfectly well what truly matters to you. He visibly froze in place. 8 years had passed, and this was the first time he saw Irene cry. His Adam's apple bobbed as if he wanted to say something. But just then, his phone rang. Joanna, the cufflinks were left at your place. All right, I'll come get them now, hanging up the phone. He gave Irene a complicated look. I misunderstood you. Your bracelet. He paused. I'll have it repaired. With that, he turned and left without even glancing at the jade bracelet shattered into 3 pieces on the ground. Irene knelt on the floor, cradling her grandmother's heirloom. As large teardrops fell onto the broken jade, at this point, he still can't be bothered to apologize. Does he think that because she loves him so much, she'll forgive him for anything? He won't touch her because of his cleanliness obsession, yet she still loves him. He neglects her for Joanna, yet she still loves him. Now that Joanna has smashed her grandmother's heirloom for his sake, she would still love him as always, so he didn't need to say anything. But this time, he was utterly wrong. For the next few days, Calvin didn't return home. Irene no longer cared, packing her luggage alone. Days passed, and soon it was the day before the divorce. Irene had already booked her departure flight when her phone suddenly received a friend request from Joanna. MS, Irene, can we talk? She stared at the message for a long time before finally replying with an okay. In the coffee shop, Joanna sat by the window, her long hair slightly curled, her makeup exquisite, exuding elegance in every gesture. Irene sat down opposite her, her expression calm. Joanna looked up at her, a gentle smile on her lips. MS, Irene. I apologize for suddenly asking you out. Something wrong? Irene asked indifferently. Joanna stirred her coffee gently, her tone apologetic. I only recently found out that you and Calvin were actually married. Irene twitched the corner of her mouth. Not for much longer. Joanna visibly froze for a moment before frowning. What do you mean? Are you two getting divorced? Well, we'll get the divorce certificate tomorrow. Joanna's lips curled into a fleeting smile. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She lowered her lashes and asked softly, is it because of me? Irene remained silent. Joanna sighed, explaining to herself, Calvin and we really did have an unforgettable relationship once. He loved me very much back then, she said softly, her fingertips gently tracing the rim of her cup. I had a bad temper, I was willful, but he never got angry. He only indulged me unconditionally, once, for my birthday. He flew overseas overnight to surprise me, but his flight was delayed, and he waited at the airport for an entire night. The day I broke up with him, he drank himself into a stupor, almost getting alcohol poisoning. Later I went abroad, and he pretended not to care on the surface, but in reality, he would secretly come to see me every year, sending me gifts through friends. Irene listened quietly, her heart feeling as if it were being slowly carved open by a blunt knife. So, those days he disappeared weren't for business trips, but to visit her. So, those nights he got drunk weren't because of work pressure, but because of her. So, he was never incapable of love, just incapable of loving her. She once thought that Calvin was born cold and had severe misophobia. even finding it dirty to touch her. But it turned out, he wasn't incapable of tenderness, it was just that his tenderness never belonged to her. Joanna continued, her voice tinged with nostalgia. He really loved me, so, Irene suddenly interrupted her, raising her eyes to meet hers directly. Are you here to show off to me? Joanna didn't expect to be seen through, her expression stiffening. How could that be? Just what? Irene sneered. Just came to tell me how much he loves you, and how ridiculous I am. Joanna's expression finally changed. Irene, you've misunderstood. There's no misunderstanding. Irene stood up, looking down at her. Joanna, I didn't divorce because you two kept in touch, it's because I have an obsession with purity. I can't accept my husband having someone else in his heart, so I chose to let him go, and to free myself. She picked up her bag and turned to leave. But just as she stepped out the door, Joanna suddenly chased after her and grabbed her arm. Irene, please let me explain. Irene shook off her hand, her tone icy. No need. Just as she was about to hail a taxi, a speeding out-of-control car suddenly came barreling toward them. In the blink of an eye, Irene only saw a familiar figure rushing forward. Calvin pulled Joanna into his arms, while Irene dodged at the last second by dropping to the ground yet still got sideswiped. She tumbled onto the pavement, her arms and knees instantly scraped raw, blood seeping through. She gasped in pain, but when she looked up, she saw Calvin holding Joanna tightly, his eyes frantically checking if she was hurt. Joanna, are you okay? His voice carried an unprecedented tension. Joanna paled and shook her head. I'm fine. Calvin finally relaxed, then turned to look at Irene. She was struggling to stand up, supporting herself on the ground, blood dripping from her fingertips. His brow furrowed slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he only asked coldly, Are you okay? Irene looked at him and suddenly smiled. Won't die. She turned to leave. Calvin suddenly called out to her, Let me take you to the hospital. Her steps faltered, and without turning her head, she said, Don't you have misophonia? I'm covered in blood, I wouldn't want to dirty your car. With that, she walked away without looking back. The doctor at the hospital cleaned and bandaged her wound. By the time she returned home, it was already late at night. Pushing open the door, she froze for a moment. Calvin was actually home. He sat on the sofa. His suit jacket draped beside him, his tie slightly loosened, as if he had been waiting for a long time. At the sound of the door opening, he looked up, his gaze settling on the bandage wrapped around her arm. His brow furrowed slightly. Is it serious? Irene didn't answer, only asking calmly, What do you want? Calvin paused for a moment before finally speaking. Give me the bracelet, I'll find someone to repair it. Irene twitched the corner of her mouth. No need. I've already found someone to fix it. He was visibly startled, seemingly not expecting her to be so calm. About today, he paused, as if wanting to explain something. No need to explain, Irene interrupted him. I don't care anymore. Calvin frowned. What do you mean? Irene was about to speak when his phone suddenly rang, a message from Joanna. He immediately stood up. I have to go, Span. She quickly called out to stop him. Tomorrow at 10, let's meet at your law firm. I have something important to give you, Span. He stared at her for 2 seconds before finally nodding. All right. The next day, Irene went to the civil affairs office on time and obtained her divorce certificate. Afterwards, she carried her luggage and went to Calvin's law firm. She sat in his office, waiting quietly. 10 o'clock, 10:30, 11 o'clock, he never showed up. She called him, sent messages, all vanished without a trace. At midnight, the call finally went through. Hello. Calvin responded with an icy voice tinged with impatience. It's me. Don't you remember we agreed to meet at the law firm at 10? Irene said calmly. I'm busy, whatever it is, can't you just say it directly? Was it really necessary to arrange a meeting at the law firm? His tone remained cold. She hesitated for a few seconds before finally speaking. I have a document to give you. What documents? She was about to speak when Joanna's soft voice came through the phone. Calvin. I'm in so much pain, Calvin immediately said. Just leave the stuff in the office. Don't bother me with such trivial matters. With that, he hung up the phone directly. Irene stood still for a moment, holding her phone. Then, she took out the divorce certificate that belonged to Calvin, along with the divorce agreement he had personally signed, and gently placed them on his desk. Calvin, it's over between us. She turned and left without looking back. In the VIP hospital room, Calvin sat on the bedside companion chair, holding a cup of warm water. A thin mist condensed on the glass surface, making his well-defined fingers appear even more slender. Joanna leaned slightly against the headboard, taking small sips of the warm water he was feeding her. Drink slowly. Calvin leaned forward slightly, bringing the glass closer. The doctor said you shouldn't gulp water now, it might make you choke. Calvin, am I being too much trouble? Calvin pulled out a tissue and gently wiped the corner of her lips. He softened his movements, his tone laced with tenderness. Don't talk nonsense. Placing the glass on the nightstand, he tucked in the blanket around her. You just woke up, don't overthink it. Get some more rest. Joanna shook her head instead, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't want to sleep. The hospital is so stuffy. Gazing at the overcast sky outside the window, she suddenly turned to him. A hint of hope in her voice. Will you take me to the amusement park for a day, please? Seeing her somewhat pale complexion, he tried to soften his tone, but when he met Joanna's suddenly dimmed gaze, he swallowed the rest of his words. Okay, he heard himself say this, his fingers unconsciously tugging at the corner of the blanket. Once you can get out of bed, we'll go. Joanna's eyes instantly brightened. Really? Seeing him nod, she happily snuggled deeper under the covers. Then I'll sleep now, so I can get better quickly. Calvin watched as she closed her eyes, her breathing gradually steadying. He sat by the bed for a while, making sure she was sound asleep, before quietly getting up to leave. The smell of disinfectant in the hallway was a bit strong. Calvin pulled out his phone and opened the chat with Irene. His fingers tapped in the message box. Can't make it back tonight. Go to sleep first. After some thought, he added another line. I'm going to the amusement park tomorrow. Didn't you say last time you wanted to go? I happen to be free. The moment he pressed send, he suddenly realized he'd never actually accompanied her to such places before. A strange feeling inexplicably arose in his heart. These thoughts were immediately suppressed the moment they surfaced. He was taking Joanna to see in advance which activities would be suitable for someone just discharged from the hospital. It had nothing to do with Irene. However, Irene didn't immediately pop up with a message as she usually did. Calvin glanced at the time, tucked his phone back into his pocket, and turned to return to the ward. It wasn't until evening when Joanna woke briefly, had some porridge, and fell back asleep that he took out his phone again. The chat window still showed only the 2 messages he'd sent earlier. Calvin furrowed his brows even deeper. Irene never acted like this, no matter how busy she was. She always replied to his messages. What's going on? Playing hard to get. At 9 p.m., Calvin instructed the nurses to keep a close eye on the ward before driving home. The villa was brightly lit. Hasn't she come back yet? Calvin casually asked the housekeeper who came forward with water. Madam hasn't returned since afternoon. I thought she was with you. Calvin paused as he took the water glass, the chill from its surface seeping through his skin. He pulled out his phone and directly sent the amusement park's location, adding a message. 10 a.m. tomorrow, be on time. As the sent successfully notification popped up, he casually tossed his phone onto the nightstand. He didn't want to speculate Irene's reasons for being upset. She'd show up tomorrow anyway, because she had never once refused him. When he woke the next day, sunlight streaming through the gap in the curtains was already glaring. Calvin grabbed his phone, no new messages on the screen. He stared at that silent chat window for 2 seconds, and an inexplicable anger flared up inside him. Irene hasn't replied to the message yet, still giving me the silent treatment. Just as I was about to open the dial pad, my assistant called. Mr. Calvin, MS. Joanna is awake. Got it, I'll be right there. He suppressed his irritation. As he got up to change clothes, his gaze swept over the photo frame on the bedside table. In the photo, Irene was wearing a wedding dress, standing beside him with a bright smile, while he himself wore an expressionless face. On the way to the hospital, he checked his phone again, still no messages. When he entered the hospital room, Joanna was sitting on the bed eating breakfast. Seeing him come in, she pointed outside the window. The weather's nice today, how about we go to the amusement park? Calvin was just about to speak when her next words cut him off. The doctor said I'm recovering well, a little walk should be fine. She tugged his hand gently and swayed it. Please, just this once. Seeing the hopeful look in her eyes, he agreed without hesitation. Okay. He reached out to take her coat. I'll go handle the discharge procedures. Half an hour later, the two arrived at the largest amusement park. Joanna grabbed his hand and immediately headed for the roller coaster. Calvin gazed at the roller coaster tracks not far away, hesitation flickering in his heart. That's too intense. He tried to slow his pace. You just got out of the hospital. Your body. I'm fine. Joanna had already pulled him into the line. She looked up at him with sparkling eyes. See, I'm perfectly fine now. Aren't I? He glanced sideways at Joanna, who completely failed to notice his clenched fingers and pale face. Calvin, what's wrong? After getting off the roller coaster, Joanna finally noticed something was off with him. Calvin leaned against the railing, bending over to take deep breaths as his stomach churned violently. He didn't dare look up, afraid to meet Joanna's puzzled gaze. It's nothing, maybe just low blood sugar. Then let's go get something to eat. Joanna pulled him toward the restaurant. This place makes the best tacos. For some reason, whenever tacos were mentioned, he always thought of Irene. She also really enjoys eating tacos. Calvin's footsteps came to a halt. Irene, It's always Irene, Calvin. Joanna's voice pulled him back to reality. Why did you stop walking? Calvin straightened up, his face regaining composure though his fingertips remained cold. It's nothing. He took her hand and walked forward. Yet his gaze involuntarily drifted toward his phone. The screen showed no new messages. From yesterday until now, Irene hadn't replied for over 10 hours. What are you looking at? Joanna leaned over for a glance. Is it something from work? No. Calvin stuffed his phone back into his pocket, his tone slightly stiff. Just can't reach Irene. Then you should go look for her quickly. What if something happened? I'll be fine on my own. Calvin looked at her earnest face, and the inexplicable irritation in his heart suddenly found an outlet. He blurted out almost without thinking. All right, I'll take you back first, then go find her. The words slipped out before he realized it, and even he was taken aback. Joanna's smile froze for a split second, a shadow flickering swiftly in her eyes before she quickly replaced it with an obedient expression. Then be careful on your way. After seeing Joanna home, he suddenly remembered that Irene didn't have many friends, and the places she could go were few and far between. Moreover, the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't really know her friends either. Calvin felt as if something was clogging his heart, making it hard to breathe. For the first time, an indescribable panic rose in his heart. He took out his phone, opened the chat with Irene, typed and deleted, leaving only a blank space in the end. Calvin decided to go home first to check. He completed the hour-long journey in half his usual time. Sir, shall I heat up dinner? No need. He waved his hand dismissively. Has Madam not returned yet? No. He got up and opened the room, finding it noticeably emptier. Something's wrong. The thought pierced his heart like a fine needle. Striking unexpectedly, he took out his phone and dialed Irene's number for the third time, only to hear the same mechanical female voice. The number you have dialed cannot be reached for the moment. His knuckles turned pale as he gripped the phone. Damn it, Irene never acted like this before. Even when angry, she'd still answer his calls, at most with a slightly colder tone. But today was the first time she'd done this. He turned and went downstairs, grabbing his car keys before heading out. Calvin recalled that her friend still had a divorce case to follow up on, and perhaps she could be found there. The receptionist paused for a moment upon seeing him. Mr. Calvin. Calvin didn't wait to hear more and walked straight to his office. At a glance, he spotted a craft paper file folder placed on the desk. His heart inexplicably skipped a beat, his fingertips trembling slightly as they touched the document folder. When he opened it, the papers inside slid out, the top page glaringly stamped with the words divorce agreement. Calvin pupils constricted abruptly, his entire body freezing in place. Divorced? Irene wanted a divorce from him. How could she possibly ask for a divorce when she loved him so much? His fingers tightened, almost crushing the papers as he flipped through them. He found every line of the property division clearly stated she had only taken the $50 million from last time, the Chapman family's heirloom jewelry, the properties under his name, and the company shares. She hadn't taken any of them. The last page was the signature section. Irene and Calvin's names were on opposite sides. His fingers tightened, almost clutching those sheets of paper as he flipped through them. He checked several times. Those were indeed his own signatures. Below was the date, marked as just 2 days prior, 2 days ago. Calvin's mind felt like it had been struck by a sledgehammer, and amidst the chaos, a fragment suddenly flashed through. That day, Irene brought over a stack of power of attorney agreements, saying it was to help a friend with a divorce case, and asked for his assistance. At the time, he was busy replying to Joanna's message, so he just skimmed through the documents and signed them without even looking closely at the headers. Now it's clear that was never any client's commission, but rather her divorce papers. A buzz rang through his head as blood rushed to his temples. He'd always assumed Irene couldn't live without him, that her careful attempts to please him were only natural, that remembering all his preferences was just an act she put on for outsiders. He even thought that her not replying to his messages yesterday and not going to the amusement park today were just petty tantrums, and that she would be fine after he went back and sweet-talked her a little. But this flimsy piece of paper felt like a resounding slap, landing squarely on his face. Calvin felt a burning pain. Mr. Calvin. The assistant's voice sounded at the door, carrying a hint of timidity. Did you need something from me? Where is she? Calvin jerked his head up, his eyes bloodshot, all traces of his usual composure completely gone. He slammed the divorce papers onto the desk, the sound of paper hitting wood piercingly loud in the quiet office. Irene, where the hell is she? The assistant, startled by his unprecedented outburst, quickly replied, Madam came by yesterday, but as for where she is now, find her for me now. Yes, Mr. Calvin. Calvin collapsed into his chair. Finally realizing she wasn't just throwing a tantrum, she truly meant to leave. He had to find her. The thought exploded in his mind with unprecedented urgency. He didn't even have time to ponder why he was so frantic. Was it fear that she might reflect poorly on him, or fear that something might happen to her? The neon lights outside the window flashed by like a movie on fast forward. Calvin's heart inexplicably raced with panic. Irene was pulling her suitcase toward the boarding gate when she heard a commotion from afar. A group of middle-aged men and women in casual wear were arguing, their shrill voices nearly piercing through the airport terminal. "We just didn't manage to buy first-class tickets. Why should we pay extra? I don't care. You have to process this ticket at the original price today. We deserve first class too." A crowd quickly gathered around to watch the commotion, some pulling out their phones to film, others murmuring in hushed tones. Irene frowned slightly but kept walking without breaking stride. She had never been fond of such bustling crowds and simply wanted to finish the check-in procedures quickly so she could rest. Just then, a figure suddenly walked past the edge of the crowd. Irene caught a glimpse of the young man from the corner of her eye, tall and upright, dressed in a well-tailored dark grey suit that stood out starkly against the surrounding attire. He didn't say anything heated, merely bending down to whisper a few words into the shirt-clad man's ear before turning aside to give the staff a brief instruction. In just 3 or 4 minutes, the previously noisy man suddenly fell silent, even scratching his head somewhat awkwardly and muttering, "Forget it then." The onlookers, seeing there was no more excitement to watch, gradually dispersed. Irene paused mid-step for half a second before continuing forward. She had no interest in this kind of heroic rescue drama. All she wanted was to hurry to her seat and catch up on sleep. The first-class lounge was quiet. She took the warm water offered by the flight attendant, found her seat, and soon fell into a deep sleep. When she woke up, she felt refreshed and clear-headed. The knot of melancholy in her heart had also dissipated considerably. After what felt like an eternity of sleep, the plane encountered turbulence and jolted slightly. Irene groggily opened her eyes. "Then I realized someone had taken the seat beside me at some point." Looking closely, it was none other than the man who had resolved the dispute at the boarding gate. He was slightly tilting his head to gaze out the window, his handsome profile appearing to glow faintly. The suit he wore was a high-end custom piece from a certain Italian luxury brand, costing no small fortune. More conspicuous were the cufflinks on his shirt sleeves, with a whole sapphire embedded in the subtle pattern, refracting light with a lustrous sheen. It was an antique style she had seen at an auction, where the starting bid alone could buy a villa in the city center. Irene subtly averted her gaze and shifted slightly toward her own side, especially after Calvin. She had never been fond of people who exuded an air of capital and instinctively wanted to keep her distance. She closed her eyes again, pretending to still be asleep. The slight vibration of the plane gradually Irene's mind at ease, yet uncontrollably, Calvin's face flashed through her thoughts, like frames from a movie reel. It was his 20th birthday that day, and though he didn't like her, he still shielded her behind him at the family banquet. Those scenes had been replayed in her mind countless times, stored in her heart, sustaining her through countless moments of being ignored by him. She always believed that if she could just be a little more tolerant, wait a little longer, things between them would eventually get better. She had even planned for the future, hoping his obsessive cleanliness would become less severe. They could go on normal dates, travel together, and do all the things they wanted to do. Even after Joanna appeared, she still secretly hoped he wouldn't get a divorce. She never mentioned any of this. But now, looking back at her past plans, ridiculous. Irene curved her lips in self-mockery. It was never that he wasn't good enough, she had simply imagined too much, turning a one-woman show into a grand romance. He juggled between her and Joanna. Irene had never been chosen, so even when facing Joanna's provocations in silence, she numbed herself countless times with the thought that things will get better. As for Calvin, she tolerated everything, all because of that beautiful illusion in her heart. The roar of the engine suddenly intensified, and the clouds outside the window drew nearer. I should have realized it long ago. Calvin's world is too vast, filled with his law firm and people he can't let go of. The space he ever allotted her was always just a tiny fraction. It was her own refusal to wake up that kept her lingering in this unequal relationship for so many years. The flight attendant pushed the meal cart by. Irene asked for a sandwich. The satisfaction in her stomach brought a sudden clarity to her muddled thoughts. The plane finally broke through the thick clouds, and sunlight abruptly flooded in, making her squint. She turned her head slightly, letting the light wash over her face. Calvin. All that tolerance and expectation, all those wasted moments, from this moment on, they truly had nothing to do with her anymore. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent goodbye in her heart, not to the him of the past, but to the stubborn, unwilling to let go version of herself. In this drawn-out theater of love, she was the first to exit the stage. Only when the landing announcement sounded did Irene stand up and walk out without looking back. After leaving the airport, Irene took a taxi directly back to the apartment she had rented in advance. It was an old apartment located on the outskirts. She unpacked her suitcase, taking out a few clothes, books related to her profession, and some commonly used medicine she had brought from home. Only when she saw the tidy room did she finally feel settled. Actually, she was quite financially comfortable. She had saved most of that 10 million, keeping only a small portion as living expenses, which was enough for her to live a leisurely life. But she didn't want to stay idle, so before going abroad, she had already scheduled interview times with several companies in advance. After 3 days of jet lag, Irene arrived punctually at the interview location. It was a small but well-regarded organization, with its office piled high with donated supplies and walls covered in photos of aid work conducted in various regions. She filled out the form and sat there, mentally rehearsing potential interview questions. Next, Irene. She stood up and pushed the door open to enter the interview room. 3 people were seated in the room. The one in the middle was the head of the organization, while the other 2 were likely division managers from different departments. Irene was about to greet them when her gaze froze upon sweeping over the interviewer on the right. Sitting there was the very same man who had been seated beside her on the plane. He was dressed more formally today, appearing meticulously put together. At this moment, he was also looking at her. A faint trace of surprise flickering in his eyes, Irene suppressed her astonishment and calmly introduced herself as requested, then began answering the interviewer's questions. She tried her best to ignore the presence of the man beside her, focusing instead on articulating her professional skills and understanding of the project. Throughout the entire process, she could feel the man's gaze occasionally falling upon her, just as the interview was about to conclude. The person in charge suddenly asked a pointed question. If you encounter local resistance while providing aid in the area, what would be your first reaction? The question was sharp. Irene answered calmly. First, ensure the safety of team members. I believe the prerequisite for helping others is to protect ourselves first, otherwise we'd just become a burden to others. The interviewer nodded slightly and didn't press further. The men's answers were all quite similar, and the interviewer kept nodding in agreement. After the interview concluded, the interviewer said with a smile, "Both of your qualifications meet our requirements perfectly. You can start work tomorrow." Irene had just thanked him and was about to leave when the man stood up, approached her, and extended his hand. "We meet again," he said. "My name is Daniel." His fingers were distinctly knuckled. Irene hesitated for a moment before reaching out to give a light shake. "Irene." "What a coincidence." Daniel withdrew his hand, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We're in the same group. I look forward to working with you." Irene paused for a moment. "Do you already know the team roster?" "Yeah," he explained, "but I'm new to this field and don't know much yet. The supervisor said you should show me the ropes." Irene was somewhat surprised but nodded nonetheless. "I'll do my best." She initially thought this was just polite conversation. But after joining the company, Daniel really did follow her around every day. At first she felt somewhat uncomfortable, always thinking he must come from a well-off family, and couldn't help worrying he was some rich kid here to experience life. But within a few days, Irene realized she'd been somewhat judgmental. Daniel was far more familiar with the inventory list than she had expected, able to accurately state the shelf life and storage conditions of each medication. He could also fluently speak several local languages, with such strong linguistic abilities that he even taught himself some dialects. While everyone was organizing the warehouse, he would squat on the ground, meticulously sorting and tidying up scattered supplies with remarkable patience. He didn't put on airs at all. Once, when they went to help at a temporary clinic in the suburbs, they encountered an agitated family member of a patient who was about to throw stones at people. Irene hadn't even reacted yet when Daniel stepped in front of her, calmly communicating with the person in dialect. With just a few words, he managed to soothe their emotions and even helped arrange follow-up treatment plans. On their way back that day, Irene couldn't help but ask him, "You seem to be good at everything. Back when I was abroad, I did similar assistant work, so I'm not a complete novice." Gradually, Irene's opinion of him began to change, from initial politeness and distance. They gradually became colleagues who could discuss both work and trivial matters. Besides often searching for good Chinese food together, Irene would also bring him homemade steamed buns. Daniel would always enthusiastically appreciate them, which pleased her greatly. On weekends, Daniel would also take the initiative to invite her to watch a documentary about African wildlife. Irene thought for a moment and agreed, because she didn't know why she always felt a sense of dependence on him. And being with him always made her feel physically and mentally relaxed. The phone suddenly rang sharply, and the 2 characters Joanna flashing on the screen made Calvin frown tightly. He almost instinctively swiped to answer the call, with chaotic music blaring in the background. Joanna's tearful voice struggled to be heard. "Calvin, have you found Irene?" Don't panic, not yet, I still have people searching. Calvin's voice was laced with exhaustion as the music grew louder on the other end. Where are you? I'm at Nightfall. It's Earl's birthday today, did you forget? Joanna's voice was intermittent, and he couldn't quite make out what she was saying. Calvin only then remembered that he had indeed received a message in the afternoon, but he had absent-mindedly swiped it away without paying attention. Irene had been missing for quite some time, and there had been no news of her at all. How could this not make him anxious? He was about to speak when a strange man's voice suddenly cut in from the receiver, with a slightly flippant chuckle. Beautiful lady, drinking alone, let Big Brother keep you company. Don't touch me. Joanna's voice instantly rose. Filled with panic, Calvin's hand tightened slightly around his phone. Joanna, Calvin. Joanna's voice was so full of grievance it sounded like she was about to cry. Don't be afraid. I'm coming right away. Calvin hung up the phone and immediately ran towards the parking lot. The black Ferrari weaved through traffic as he checked the navigation, an inexplicable irritation rising in his chest. He couldn't tell whether it was because of Joanna or Irene. The lights at the entrance of the bar were dazzling. Calvin pushed open the door, and the deafening music immediately surged in, mixed with the smell of alcohol. He glanced at the swaying crowd on the dance floor. His gaze settling on a corner of the bar, there sat Joanna in a white dress, surrounded by two men. Move aside. Calvin's voice was not loud, but it carried an innate sense of oppression. The two men turned to see the expensive watch on his wrist and the row of bodyguards behind him, without daring to say another word. They left in frustration. Joanna, startled like a frightened deer, suddenly threw herself into his arms, her shoulders trembling slightly. Calvin, you're here. I was so scared. The familiar scent of perfume mixed with alcohol wafted into his nostrils, and Calvin's body stiffened. He raised his hand to push her away, but when his fingertips touched her back, he paused. In the end, he only stiffly patted her back. It's all right now, I'll take you home. Calvin, the host of the birthday party, Earl, walked over with a glass in hand and froze at the sight. What are you doing here? Joanna said you couldn't make it because you had something to do. Calvin didn't look at him, keeping his gaze fixed on the trembling Joanna in his arms. Who let her drink this much? Couldn't you have stopped her? Earl was taken aback by the reproach in his tone and scratched his head in explanation. No one encouraged her. Joanna started downing drinks as soon as she arrived. We asked what was wrong, but she wouldn't say, just kept muttering about feeling awful. And anyway, you would have come to pick her up, so we didn't try to persuade her further. He understood that it wasn't just Earl. All their friends were convinced that wherever Joanna was, Calvin would be there too. Calvin said nothing more, scooping Joanna up into his arms and heading for the door. She was so light, almost frighteningly so. Joanna didn't resist, docilely curling up in his arms as if asleep. As they reached the doorway, Joanna suddenly raised her arms drowsily to wrap around his neck and murmured softly, Calvin, don't leave me behind, okay? Calvin's footsteps came to a halt. The person in his arms breathed evenly, clearly heavily intoxicated. He remained silent as he opened the passenger door. When placing her inside, her hands still clung tightly to his shirt, refusing to let go. He let her hold him for a while before gently pulling away. The car was quiet as Calvin started the engine, the rearview mirror reflecting the fading lights of the bar. I want some water, the voice came from the passenger seat. Joanna's words husky with the effects of alcohol. Calvin parked the car in the spot below Joanna's apartment building. As he helped her into the elevator, her head remained resting on his shoulder. After entering, he placed her on the sofa and turned to the kitchen to pour some water. When he looked back, Joanna was gripping his wrist, her eyes half open. Don't go, please, you're drunk, get some rest. Calvin tried to pull his hand away, but she gripped it tighter, her nails nearly digging into his skin. It's because of Irene, isn't it? Joanna's voice suddenly became clear, without a trace of drunkenness. You actually care about her deep down, that's why you married her, right? Calvin frowned. No, then what is it? Joanna suddenly sat upright, her collar slipping to reveal snow-white collarbones. You clearly like me, don't you? Why can't we be together? I'm married. Calvin cut her off, his voice cold as ice. Joanna, you should know this. Joanna's eyes instantly reddened, tears streaming down her cheeks. So what if you're married? Can't you just divorce for me? Divorced? It seemed that thought had never crossed his mind. He withdrew his hand and turned to walk towards the entrance. Get some good rest. Stepping out the door, Calvin suddenly remembered he'd left his car keys on the console table by the entrance, so he turned back, and just as he reached the corner of the entrance hall, he heard Joanna talking on her phone. Her voice completely devoid of any previous grievance. Guess what? I just casually mentioned someone was bothering me, and Calvin showed up in 5 minutes. He still cares about me. The voice of someone named Kay came through the receiver, sharp and spiteful. You're still the best at this. What about Irene? Found her yet? I think she's deliberately hiding, just trying to make Calvin anxious. Who does she think she is, acting all high and mighty? Who knows where he ran off to? Joanna's voice was laced with disdain. Calvin's steps froze in place, his blood seemingly congealing instantly. He looked at her face, finding it utterly unfamiliar. I'm telling you, I'm determined to take the position of Mrs. Chapman. Joanna lowered her voice, filled with unwavering confidence. I already invited her out for a chat before. She seemed naive, but it was probably an act. When I talked to her again, divorce is inevitable. Smack. A crisp sound echoed through the room as Calvin knocked over a crystal-clear glass. The phone slipped from Joanna's hand. She whirled around to see Calvin standing in the shadow of the entryway, his gaze as cold as forged ice, fixed unblinkingly on her. Calvin. Joanna's face turned deathly pale, her lips trembling as she staggered back 2 steps and collided with the sofa. You didn't leave. The phone lay fallen on the carpet, Kay still chattering incessantly on the other end. Joanna. What's wrong? Hello, say something. Calvin bent down to pick up his phone and pressed the end call button. The living room suddenly fell into a deathly silence, with only the ticking of the wall clock echoing loudly, striking uncomfortably against the heart. So, Calvin's voice was soft, yet carried an undeniable pressure. He stepped closer to Joanna, the dull thud of his leather shoes echoing across the floor. You were pretending all along, weren't you? Even Irene, you deliberately stirred things up with her. Joanna's tears began to fall again. No, Calvin, please let me explain. I just love you too much. I was afraid you'd be deceived by Irene. Deceive me. Calvin stopped in his tracks, looking down at her with overwhelming disappointment swirling in his eyes. Joanna, you do have a place in my heart, but I never imagined you'd scheme against me like this. Slandering Irene. I never slandered her. She left of her own free will. Joanna suddenly raised her voice, as if struck where it hurt most. I'm telling the truth. That woman Irene never loved you. She only married you for the Chapman family's money. She had ulterior motives. Enough. Calvin cut her off, his voice trembling slightly. From today onward, there's no need for further contact. Calvin. Joanna practically stumbled and crawled towards him, her fingers clutching desperately at the sleeve of his suit. Tears welled up without warning, scalding as they fell onto his cuff. Don't go. I was wrong. I truly know I was wrong. Calvin's footsteps halted, but he didn't turn around. A sudden memory of her from long ago flashed through his mind. Back then, Joanna had eyes that sparkled like starlight. She was the one who stood up for him during his most wretched moments, the eternally pure and untainted presence in his heart. Yet now he realized he had been wrong, and it was a terrible mistake. I was just too scared. Joanna's voice choked up, her fingers turning white from gripping too hard. I was afraid you'd be taken away by Irene. When I heard you two got married, I became even more terrified. Calvin, can you forgive me just this once? Just this one time. Calvin slowly turned around, his gaze falling on her tear-streaked face. He gazed at her in silence for a long time, so long that Joanna felt her glimmer of hope gradually devoured by unease. Joanna, he finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. In my heart, you shouldn't be like this. Shouldn't be so calculating. Shouldn't be so scheming. Joanna's pupils constricted violently, as if struck by these words, her entire body trembling. She stared blankly at Calvin, his eyes holding no anger, no accusation, only disappointment. You. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her fingers, clutching the sleeve, unconsciously loosened their grip. Calvin didn't spare her another glance. He turned, pulled open the door, and left, clean, decisive. Without a trace of hesitation, he turned and walked toward the entrance, picking up his car keys without giving Joanna another glance. At the doorway, he paused, his back still turned to her, and said, you can continue going to the hospital for the injury on your leg, but that's it. From now on, don't show yourself in front of me again. Back in the car, his assistant called. Mr. Calvin, I've found information about Madam. She's taken a job at a company overseas. After saying these words, the assistant paused, then sent another photo. Irene walking side by side with a man, seen from behind. His heart gave a violent jolt. Had she already met someone new? He didn't dare let his thoughts continue down that path. Send me all the information immediately, then book me the fastest flight available. But the law firm still has multiple projects requiring your typesetting. It might not be appropriate for you to leave now. The secretary certainly knew it was inappropriate to bring this up now, but he felt compelled to offer his advice. Sure enough, Calvin lost his temper the moment he finished speaking. Just listen to me. Yes, Mr. Calvin. He hung up the phone, his head throbbing as if it might split apart. His hands trembled slightly the entire way to the airport, because he couldn't grasp Irene's thoughts. Even less did he know how she would react upon seeing him. Why had they divorced in the first place? Is it because of Joanna? Or did she find out when I went to see Joanna earlier? Calvin endured what felt like the longest 30 minutes of his life. Calvin arrived just as Irene was on leave. She went to the supermarket to buy some groceries, planning to cook a meal at home. As she turned the corner, she suddenly spotted a familiar figure. Irene frowned and stared for a long time. She realized that person looked exactly like Calvin. But how could he possibly be here when he was supposed to be back in the country? She dismissed the thought and went straight upstairs. The hot pot had just been put into the pot when a sudden ringtone broke the silence. She picked up her phone and saw an unfamiliar number. Calvin's voice drifted lazily from the other end. Are you really that eager to leave me behind? Her mind snapped awake in an instant. Irene immediately rushed to the window, and there he stood, right below. She hadn't been mistaken. Calvin, what are you doing here? I came to find you. Her voice was clearly surprised, but there was no trace of happiness in it. Calvin felt the panic hidden in his heart becoming somewhat uncontrollable at this moment. He could no longer restrain himself. I didn't agree to the divorce. You can't go through the procedures without my consent. As soon as the words fell, both of them fell silent. Irene took a deep breath. But you've already signed, the document has taken effect, and I've even picked up the divorce certificate. It's tucked inside the divorce agreement. Didn't you see it? After she finished speaking, Calvin on the other end of the phone remained silent. She even doubted several times whether she had already hung up, because there was no sound at all. Calvin, I have never regretted marrying you, because I truly love you, but after we got married, I found it wasn't as simple as I thought. There were all sorts of problems to solve, but you never seemed to be on my side, especially after Joanna appeared. I saw your favoritism towards her, so I don't want to be an obstacle between you two. So I've decided to end this relationship here. Only this way, it will be a good outcome for both of us, won't it? Good outcome. Calvin repeated these words softly. After marrying Irene, he had indeed felt something, but the appearance of Joanna made his heart begin to waver. With each passing day of contact with Joanna, he grew increasingly conflicted, even beginning to indulge in it, unable to extricate himself. He couldn't let go of Joanna, nor could he forget the kindness of Irene. But only after discovering Joanna's true nature did Calvin realize that in his heart, Irene seemed to occupy a larger space. So the man who had never bowed in his life came. For Irene, she set aside her dignity. In the end, it was just as he couldn't accept the fact that she had already let him go. He stubbornly refused to let go. Feeling he must have an answer, "Can we meet?" His tone carried a hint of humility, so much so that Irene was somewhat taken aback. Watching that persistent figure, she softly replied, "All right." That was the only response she could give him. "If there's nothing else, I'll hang up now. See you at 7 tomorrow." Her tone remained light, as if inviting an old friend. As soon as the words fell, the long-standing confusions that had plagued Calvin's mind slowly dissipated in her voice. He didn't blame her, yet he himself had also fallen into confusion. Calvin was at a loss. He pondered for a long time that night. He recalled the 6 full years from when they first met until their marriage. Time and again, she had played the same old tricks before him, but he never gave her any response in return. Instead, he became even more distant toward her because of Joanna's appearance. Calvin felt guilty in his heart, but what he felt even more was regret. He regretted not seeing through Joanna's false affection sooner, and for turning a blind eye to Irene's genuine feelings. But Irene had made up her mind clearly. Her heart was resolute when she decided to leave. Regardless of anyone, she would never forgive Calvin again. The wind carried a chill as it brushed against his face. Calvin's heart tightened abruptly when he saw that familiar figure again. Irene stood there just like that, letting the wind tousle her long hair. She seemed to have grown thinner again. She appeared as thin as a sheet of paper. He walked over with light steps. Irene didn't turn around, only saying softly, "What exactly do you want from me?" "Irene." Calvin's voice was slightly hoarse. "I'm sorry I'm late." Irene turned her head. "I know I'm not in your heart. But we're divorced now, aren't we? You can be with whoever you like." Calvin remained silent for a moment, then recounted word for word everything he had heard at Joanna's house. He expected Irene to get angry or to question him, but she simply listened quietly. Only after he finished did she sigh softly. "She did come to me, but I also told her we would divorce. Why didn't you tell me?" Calvin stepped forward. "What good would it do to tell you?" Irene smiled, but weariness flickered in her eyes. "Would you believe me? You wouldn't believe a word I say. I didn't take that cufflink last time, but you didn't believe me then either." Calvin felt a pang in his heart. He remembered how he had even rummaged through the trash can last time, searching for that cufflink. He had even suspected she took it, simply because it was a gift from Joanna to him. "Irene," he grasped her hand tightly, looking earnestly into her eyes. "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." Irene gazed at him, shaking off his hand. "Calvin, we're already over." Calvin's heart sank abruptly. Just as he was about to speak, Irene shook her head. It's not because of Joanna. It's because there were always problems between us. My heart is exhausted from carrying your hot and cold behavior. Just like your cleanliness obsession, I thought it was real. But it turns out it was only because I'm not Joanna. You couldn't overcome it because you don't love me. I thought I could move your heart. But never imagined how laughable that was. The wind lifted her long hair. Calvin gazed at her delicate profile and suddenly realized he might have gone too far, never leaving. He heard himself say, with a firmness never heard before, Irene, give me a chance, I'll handle Joanna's matter, and, learn how to love you properly. Irene's eyelashes fluttered slightly, but she remained silent. Something came flying across the distant water surface, sending ripples exploding in layers. The two remained silent for a long time. Irene finally spoke slowly. I truly loved you before, but after all this entanglement, I've already let go. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned to leave. Calvin but reached out to stop her. Let go. His eyes burned crimson. You're not leaving, we're over. Irene struggled fiercely, red marks quickly blooming on her wrists. Calvin, you're hurting me. At that moment, a figure appeared in the distance, running toward them. Daniel stepped forward, blocking the space between them. Let her go. Calvin suddenly turned his gaze toward him, eyes icy. And who are you? Before Daniel could say another word, his fist was already swinging through the air with a whoosh. With a dull thud, Daniel was caught off guard, staggering and falling to the ground. The side of his face quickly swelled red, and a trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his lips. Calvin, Irene screamed, shaking off Calvin's hand and rushing to steady the swaying Daniel, her anger overpowering her panic. Have you lost your mind? Calvin stood frozen in place, his shirt cuffs disheveled, his chest heaving violently. He had still lost his composure, watching her carefully supporting Daniel's back. The motion felt like a sharp blade plunging into the softest part of his heart. Yes, I've gone mad. He stepped forward, trying to grasp Irene's wrist, but she recoiled in disgust. Calvin's voice was hoarse with desperation, his eyes burning with obsession. Irene, are you really so eager to leave me? For him? Irene didn't answer, only shooting him a fierce glare, supporting Daniel as he stood straight. She asked softly, Daniel, can you walk? Let me take you to the hospital. Daniel nodded through the pain, his gaze sweeping past Calvin with unspoken complexity before finally looking away. Irene supported him as they walked out, not even glancing back. Calvin stood frozen, utterly alone in the space. His fist still trembled slightly from the earlier punch, but the physical ache paled against the hollowness in his chest. He slowly turned his head to watch that receding figure. There Irene was, carefully shielding Daniel as they walked side by side under the streetlights, their shadows stretching long behind them. A sense of defeat washed over him like a tidal wave. Calvin slowly crouched down, that single sentence echoing relentlessly in his mind. I really did love you before, but after all this back and forth, I've let go. Does she really not love me anymore? Doubt swirled in Calvin's mind, but only the wind answered him. Irene's fingertips had just touched Daniel's cheek, where a burning redness swelled. His sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but under the light, the swollen redness looked even more alarming. Go to the hospital, just a minor injury, no need. Daniel raised his hand to rub it, but Irene slapped it away. Her grip on his wrist was firm. How is this nothing? Get in the car. Her car was parked at the street corner, so Daniel was unceremoniously shoved into the passenger seat. There's really no need to go to the hospital. I'll take care of it when I get back. I said we're going. So we're going. Daniel indeed obediently kept quiet, though his gaze kept drifting toward her. Irene's fingers on the steering wheel were long. When the red light came on, she reached out and lightly touched his cheek. Does it hurt? Her voice softened a little. Daniel swallowed, suddenly feeling as if the pain in his cheek had vanished instantly. He shook his head, his gaze resting on her face. Not anymore. In the emergency room. As soon as the doctor touched the wound with an iodine-soaked cotton swab, Daniel furrowed his brows tightly. Catching a glimpse of Irene from the corner of his eye, he instead smiled and said, Doctor, just be gentle, I'm afraid of pain. The doctor glanced up at them, gently circling the cotton swab over the wound. It's just a bit red and swollen. It'll heal in a few days. Then, shifting his tone, he tilted his chin toward Irene and added, Your girlfriend is quite devoted. She sprinted all the way to register for you. Irene hurried to explain, We're just friends. The doctor drew out his words with a meaningful smile and said nothing more. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air. Daniel watched the blush creeping up Irene's ears and couldn't help but smile. After bandaging the wound, the doctor gave a few instructions. The way back was awkward, so much so that neither spoke. The car stopped at Irene's apartment building. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt to get out, but she called him back. Wait. Irene leaned over, her fingers threading through his neck to reach the seatbelt buckle. He held his breath, feeling his heartbeat loud enough to shatter his eardrums. Just then, Daniel suddenly spoke. Irene. Irene froze mid-motion, her nose almost brushing the corner of his lips. She looked up and met his bottomless gaze, where her own reflection shimmered. She responded instinctively, her voice slightly tight. Daniel's gaze was heavy, as if he'd been steeling himself to ask, "That man at the door earlier, was it Calvin?" Yes. Daniel didn't press further, just leaned in again to fasten her loosely secured seatbelt. His breath brushed against her ear. "From now on, I'll pick you up to and from work." Irene froze. "There's no need, it's settled," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument yet laced with gentleness. "It's on my way." She didn't believe that excuse. She knew which direction his home was in. How could going halfway across the city possibly be on his way? But seeing the earnest look in his eyes, the words of refusal stopped at my lips. "Okay," Daniel smiled, the scar at the corner of his eye seemingly fading away. The light in his eyes grew brighter. "Don't forget about the gathering next week. We'll go together." Irene nodded. Thinking of Calvin again made her heart feel as if it was soaked in ice water, cold and heavy. She didn't fall asleep until very late that night. At 8 o'clock on the day of the gathering, Daniel's car pulled up right on time downstairs. Irene chose a white maxi dress. The skirt reached her ankles, without any superfluous embellishments, yet when worn, it became strikingly radiant. As she descended the stairs, Daniel was leaning against the car while on a phone call. The setting sun cast its glow upon him, outlining his tall and straight silhouette, leaving only faint red traces on his profile. At the sight of Irene, he couldn't help but freeze for a moment. "What's wrong?" Daniel finally snapped back to reality, hurriedly saying goodbye into the phone before hanging up. "You seem very different today. Does it look strange?" Irene instinctively turned to go change her clothes, but he caught her by the wrist. His palm was warm. "No." Daniel's voice was slightly hoarse. "It's very beautiful." Just 3 simple words, yet they made Irene's heart skip a beat. She turned her face away, not daring to meet his eyes. "Hurry up, don't be late." The party was held at a 4-story hotel. As the door opened, a wave of boisterous chatter rushed out. A colleague, Lucy, spotted her from afar and waved. "Irene, over here." Irene had just walked past when Lucy grabbed her and started bombarding her with questions. Daniel was also pulled away by a few friends who hooked their arms around him. "Is there something going on between you and Daniel lately?" Lucy elbowed her playfully with a knowing look. "The way he looks at you is different." "Don't talk nonsense. We're just friends." Lucy poked her forehead. "Irene, don't tell me you can't see he likes you." Irene's heart suddenly sank. Of course she could see it. But right now, just as I was thinking, a small commotion suddenly arose behind me. Irene instinctively turned her head, her gaze cutting through the crowd to immediately fixate on the entrance. Calvin stood right there, dressed in a black suit. His figure appeared even more tall and straight. The light danced upon his hair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. Surrounded by a crowd, he exuded an air of detachment, standing amid the clamor yet seemingly alone at the summit. He had always been this way, impossible to ignore. Irene's breath caught in her throat, her blood freezing in an instant. She turned to flee almost instinctively, but her wrist was caught in his iron grip. "Long time no see." Calvin's voice was low, yet it sent chills down Irene's spine. She tried desperately to shake off his hand, only to find it impossible to break free. Their strange behavior had already drawn curious and probing glances from people nearby. This also included her direct superior. She really didn't want to make a big deal out of this. "Calvin, what exactly are you trying to do?" Calvin not only didn't let go, but instead applied slight pressure, pulling her closer towards himself. The distance between them closed in an instant, his cologne enveloping her, a scent she had once known so intimately, yet now it only suffocated her. "Just wanted to dance with you." He gave a slight nod, his tone brooking no refusal, yet his gaze remained locked on her. Whispers rose around them. She knew she couldn't lose composure here. Drawing a deep breath, she suppressed the turmoil within. "You'd better leave right after. You never know." Calvin led her to the center of the dance floor without a word. A gentle waltz began to play at just the right moment, and Calvin's dance steps were skillful and fluid. Their coordination was as ever. Irene's heart pounded, yet she was helpless. She looked at their intertwined hands, remembering his misophobia, and found it utterly ironic. An inexplicable surge of anger rose in her heart. In the moment of turning around, Irene lifted her high heel and stomped hard on Calvin's foot. She used all her strength, yet his expression didn't change in the slightest, only the hand around her waist tightened slightly. Warm breath brushed past her ear. Irene could only think of him as shameless. She clenched her teeth and continued spinning to his rhythm. As the song ended, she almost immediately shook off his hand and turned to leave. "Why do you avoid me the moment you see me? Can't we just talk?" Calvin caught up with her and grabbed her at the hallway corner. "Where are you going?" Irene looked up at him and said coldly, "Calvin, we ended long ago." He suddenly chuckled lowly. "Ended? Who agreed to that?" Irene trembled with anger at his shameless demeanor. She turned and headed straight for the stairwell. Calvin followed behind her, unhurried and steady, as if certain she couldn't escape. Irene whirled around abruptly, her gaze icy. "What exactly do you want?" "I want you by my side." Calvin looked at her with profound intensity. "Let's start over." "Okay, start over." Irene burst into sudden laughter as if she'd heard the most ridiculous joke. "Calvin, have you forgotten how you treated me all these years of marriage? Now you're pretending to be devoted. Do you think Irene can't live without you?" Calvin paled visibly, reaching out to touch her face only for her to turn away. His hand froze mid-air, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong before. I know I messed up. That's your problem." Irene cut him off, taking a step back to create distance. "Let me make this clear, don't ever show your face around me again, or I will call the police." Calvin's eyes darkened as he stared at her intently for a long moment. "Are you really no longer in love with me?" Irene's heart felt as if it had been pierced by something sharp, the pain so intense she could barely breathe. She remembered how he had ignored her when she was hurt, remembered the bracelet that shattered the day she was falsely accused. She remembered the ignored married life. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't love you anymore." Calvin froze in place. His heart felt as if squeezed by an invisible hand, the pain so intense he could barely breathe. Irene walked away without looking back, the click of her heels echoing in his ears. Calvin felt somewhat dazed. The banquet hall downstairs remained noisy. Daniel stood in the corner holding a wine glass, when he saw Irene walking out alone from the stairwell. He almost immediately set down his glass and strode over. "Are you okay?" His voice carried a barely perceptible tension. Irene shook her head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing. The wind's too strong, it's making my eyes sting." Daniel simply took off his suit jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders. "Let's go," he said, his tone softer than ever before, completely different from the carefree days of the past. Irene looked up at him, the light dancing in his eyes, full of worry. Suddenly, she felt so tired, too tired to pretend anymore, too tired that she just wanted to find a place to lean on. "Okay," she gave a slight nod. Irene instinctively turned to look back. The rooftop stood empty, with only the wind still blowing tirelessly. Actually, a friend had once asked her a question. If Calvin came looking for her, would she remarry him? This question seemed to have no preset answer in her heart. She had originally imagined he would be with Joanna. Perhaps her departure was for the best, but now it seems Calvin might have had a moment when she was in his heart. But it no longer matters. She won't look back, nor will she forgive on behalf of her past self. Calvin. She withdrew her gaze, watching Daniel's retreating figure, and suddenly felt that perhaps it was time to completely let go of the past. The plane touched down on the tarmac as a light rain suddenly began to fall from the sky. Calvin had just stepped off the plane when the damp, chilly air rushed to meet him, carrying the familiar scent of this city. He pushed away the offered umbrella, letting the rain fall freely on his face. The driver respectfully opened the car door for him, and he bent down to get inside. The car's heating was strong. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the seat as exhaustion washed over him like a tide. The car moved smoothly, the street scenes outside the window rapidly receding. Calvin had little interest in looking. He took out his phone and dialed his assistant's number. "Hey," his voice sounded slightly hoarse. The assistant on the other end of the phone clearly paused for a moment before responding respectfully. "Mr. Calvin, you've returned to the country." Calvin replied indifferently. "Come to the villa in the city center now. I have something to discuss with you." "Understood, Mr. Calvin. I'll be there right away." The assistant didn't dare delay and immediately responded. The car finally stopped in front of a villa in the western suburbs. This was where Calvin and Irene had lived together for several years. He pushed open the car door and entered the villa. The familiar scent rushed over him, yet it left him with an inexplicable emptiness. Instead of going upstairs, he walked straight to the garden in the back. Several rose bushes were in full, splendid bloom. At the sight of these flowers, Calvin's gaze softened considerably, as if seeing through them. Because Irene had loved them, they were planted by Irene. She said roses were easy to care for, had a long blooming season, and just looking at them lifted one's spirits. Back then, she always loved tending to these flowers in the garden during the evenings. Calvin stood before the rose bushes, staring blankly, his eyes filled with complex emotions. There was longing, and also guilt. 20 minutes later, his assistant stood respectfully in the center of the living room. Seeing Calvin enter, he quickly greeted him. "Mr. Calvin." Calvin nodded, motioning for him to sit. "I called you here because there's something important I need you to do, Mr. Calvin. Please instruct." Calvin looked at him and slowly began, his tone as calm as if he were discussing a trivial matter. "Go through the procedures to transfer all the shares under my name. including all shares in Chapman Group and its subsidiaries, as well as my law firm, entirely to Irene's name. What, Mr. Calvin, what did you say? Calvin looked up at him with piercing eyes. I said, transfer all my shares to Irene, can't you understand? But, Mr. Calvin, Assistant Mike hurriedly explained, beads of sweat already forming on his forehead, the shares under your name are worth billions, just transfer them all to Mrs. Irene. Calvin couldn't be bothered to explain, merely stating indifferently, I know exactly how much they're worth, just do as I say. Complete the transfer procedures as soon as possible, prepare the contracts, and send them abroad to Irene. But Mr. Calvin, the assistant still wanted to say more. No buts. Calvin cut him off with an indisputable tone. This is my decision, you just need to execute it. Yes, Mr. Calvin. I'll get it done right away. Calvin waved his hand, signaling he could leave. Assistant Mike didn't dare say more and quickly turned to exit the villa. Silence returned to the villa. Calvin leaned back on the sofa and closed his eyes, yet Irene's image surfaced in his mind. He remembered how, many years ago, Irene had said she liked money, Joanna had said the same thing, but now, he felt there was nothing wrong with loving money. If money could make her happy, could make her change her mind. Then what was the harm in giving her all of it? He knew he had hurt her deeply in the past, and wasn't money all she wanted, then he would give her every last penny. That very afternoon, Calvin's decision to transfer all his shares to Irene spread like wildfire throughout the Chapman Corporation. An eerie atmosphere permeated every corner of the headquarters building. Employees huddled in small groups, whispering with expressions of shock and bewilderment. Did you hear? The Chapman heir just returned from abroad and is transferring all his shares to that Irene. No way, that's several $100 million. Has young Master Chapman lost his mind, giving it all to his ex-wife? I think he's gone crazy too. That Irene, didn't she already break up with Calvin? Why would young Master Chapman suddenly make such a decision? Who knows, maybe something happened to him overseas. The discussions rose and fell, everyone thinking Calvin must have gone mad, otherwise. Why would someone willingly give up a perfectly good fortune worth billions, and even hand it over to a divorced woman? Isn't that sheer madness? Several senior figures of the group sat there, their expressions grim. Everyone, young Master Chapman's decision is far too reckless. Chairman Wang is right. Another director chimed in. That Irene, I've heard she's no pushover. For young Master Chapman to transfer the shares to her is practically pushing our Chapman Group into the fire. We can't just stand by and watch, we must find a way to stop young Master Chapman. But, young Master Chapman is the Chapman family's sole heir. If he wants to transfer his shares, there's nothing we can do to stop him. Everyone was talking over each other, but no one could come up with an effective solution. Meanwhile, the subject of their discussion, Calvin, was sitting in the garden of the Western Villa, leisurely admiring Irene's rose bushes. He had heard those rumors, more or less. But he paid them no mind. Mad, perhaps, to others, he must have seemed mad, giving up everything he'd worked so hard for, all for a woman who had already left him. But only Calvin knew the truth. He wasn't mad at all, he was more clear-headed than ever before. He once believed that power and wealth were the most important things, that possessing these would grant him everything he desired, but when he finally stood at the pinnacle, he realized he had lost far more. Now, all he wanted was to give everything he had to her, for no other reason than because she had once said she liked money. Suddenly, the doorbell of the villa rang abruptly. The bodyguard walked over to open the door, then quickly returned, looking somewhat troubled as he said to Calvin, Calvin, it's Joanna. She says she has urgent business with you. Let her go. Calvin's voice turned cold, laced with unmistakable disgust. The bodyguard moved to dismiss Joanna, but she had already stormed in. Her face contorted with fury as she charged straight toward Calvin. Calvin, Lucy's voice was shrill and piercing. Are the reports outside true? Are you really going to transfer all your shares to that bitch Irene? She had clearly seen the news and came storming in, furious and demanding answers. Calvin lifted his eyes, staring at her coldly, his disgust unconcealed in his gaze. My things, I'll give them to whoever I want. What does it have to do with you? What do you mean? What does it have to do with me? Joanna shouted agitatedly. Shut up, Calvin interrupted her, his voice icy and cutting. If you utter another word of nonsense here, don't blame me for being impolite. You're absolutely crazy. Joanna was speechless, her face alternating between pale and flushed. She never imagined that Calvin would be so heartless towards her. Get out. Calvin didn't want to waste any more words on her and directly ordered her to leave. Calvin. You can't do this to me, Joanna screamed hysterically. What's so great about Irene? She's already divorced you. Are you insane to give her your shares? Calvin's gaze grew increasingly cold as he waved at the bodyguards. Throw her out. Yes, Calvin. Two bodyguards immediately stepped forward, seizing Lucy by both arms. Calvin, You'll regret this, she struggled frantically, cursing incessantly through gritted teeth. Yet her struggles proved insignificant against the two burly bodyguards. Soon, she was dragged out of the villa and thrown into the rain-soaked ground outside. The villa's heavy door slammed shut, cutting off Joanna's stream of curses. Calvin frowned at the tightly shut door. He took out his phone and dialed his assistant's number. Go deal with Joanna, send her to the psychiatric hospital. Assistant Mike on the other end of the line paused for a moment, but immediately responded, understood. I'll handle it right away. After hanging up, Calvin stood up and gazed at the roses in the garden, suddenly finding them utterly devoid of charm. He turned and walked into the villa, instructing the servant, dig up those few pots of the most blooming roses. I want to take them with me, soon. Several pots of roses in full bloom were loaded into the car. Calvin glanced at the villa that held too many memories, then turned and got into the car without a trace of nostalgia, to the mountain villa. He said to the driver, that mountain villa was one he had bought by chance many years ago. It was very remote, and he had hardly ever visited it, but now, he suddenly wanted to stay there for a while, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, and away from all these disturbances. Irene, there's a package for you. Seems to be from back home. A colleague walked in holding a thick envelope and handed it to her. Irene froze for a moment, took the envelope and looked at it. The sender was Calvin. Her heart skipped a beat with a bad premonition. After all, it had been quite some time since their last meeting. She feared he might do something crazy again to give her a headache. Putting down her work, she walked aside and discovered several documents inside, their headings boldly stating share transfer agreement. Irene's heart skipped a beat as she picked up the contract in disbelief, scanning it rapidly. The terms were straightforward. Calvin was transferring all his shares in the Chapman Corporation to her. Billions in shares, just handed over to her like that. Irene's hands trembled slightly as she held the contract, convinced there must be some mistake. Why would Calvin do this? Hadn't everything between them ended long ago? She immediately pulled out her phone and dialed her assistant's number. I am Irene. Her voice trembled slightly. MS, Irene, hello. Assistant Mike's voice remained respectful as ever. I received the stock transfer agreement you sent. Irene took a deep breath, struggling to keep her voice steady. What exactly is going on? Why would Calvin transfer his shares to me? There was silence on the other end of the line before Assistant Mike responded. MS, Irene, this was Mr. Calvin's instruction. He didn't specify the reason, but Mr. Calvin has already withdrawn from both the company and law firm, and will no longer handle any operational matters. Left the company and the law firm. Irene was stunned again. She stood rooted to the spot, phone in hand, feeling a little dazed for a moment. Calvin's actions were completely beyond her comprehension. What exactly did he want to do? MS, Irene, is there anything else? Assistant Mike's voice interrupted her thoughts. It's gone. Then I'll hang up first. MS, Irene. After hanging up, Irene looked at the stock transfer agreement in her hand, her heart filled with mixed emotions. There was confusion, bewilderment, and a hint of indescribable melancholy. She had indeed told him that she liked money, but that was just something she said for him to hear. She never expected him to take it seriously, and he just threw so much money at her. Yet, when this sudden, immense wealth was laid before her, she felt not a shred of joy, but rather an overwhelming sense of it being too hot to handle. Just as Irene was feeling troubled, a gentle voice sounded behind her. What's wrong? Did something happen? Irene turned around and saw Daniel standing at the door, holding 2 cups of coffee with a warm smile on his face. Irene shook her head and forced a smile. It's nothing. I just received a rather unusual gift. You don't look like it's nothing. Did you run into some trouble? Maybe I can help if you tell me about it. Irene took the coffee, holding it in her hands, feeling its warmth. After hesitating for a moment, she briefly explained the share transfer contract and what she had said to Daniel. Daniel listened without showing much surprise, only nodding thoughtfully. Calvin, he's always been like this, never playing by the rules. He said this because Irene had mentioned his personality before, so from Daniel's perspective, Calvin isn't crazy, this is just his way of doing things. Irene gave a bitter smile. I really don't understand why he would do this. Perhaps he's just trying to make up for something, Daniel said quietly, his tone carrying a hint of barely perceptible complexity. Irene remained silent. She knew Daniel made a valid point, but she didn't need this kind of compensation. Some wounds can't be healed with money. If she truly cared about money, she wouldn't have divorced in the first place. After all, the Chapman family's wealth was practically endless. She could have spent lavishly every day, and Calvin wouldn't have said a word. Daniel noticed her low spirits and changed the subject. By the way, Irene, I'm going to Africa next week to see the Great Migration. Would you like to come along? Africa. The Great Migration. Irene paused for a moment, then her eyes lit up. Seeing the Great Migration in Africa had always been her dream. In high school, She read an autobiography that described a trip to see animals in Africa, and she yearned for it deeply in her heart, but words alone couldn't convey the experience, so she made up her mind then to visit Africa someday. Yet the opportunity never came, even when she had the financial means. There was never enough time. It remained a lingering regret in her heart, but she had mentioned this idea to Calvin more than once before, yet back then, Calvin never bothered to spare time to go with her. After that, she simply stopped bringing it up. "Are we really going?" she asked, unable to believe it. "Of course we are," Daniel said with a smile. "I know this is something you've always wanted to do, and I happen to have an opportunity this time, so I thought I'd ask you." Irene looked at Daniel's gentle smile. Feeling a surge of warmth in her heart, she nodded, revealing a long-lost smile on her face. "All right, I'll go." The long-suppressed emotions seemed to brighten a little because of this sudden good news. "But first, you'll have to accompany me to do something." "Okay." Daniel stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching Irene sign the last name on the document. The flickering numbers on the electronic screen finally settled. That astronomical transfer amount was being split into countless small sums, flowing into the accounts of welfare institutions and rural schools across the country. The last transfer. Irene snapped the pen cap shut. "The remaining 320 million will be returned to the group account, not a cent less." Daniel gazed at her calm profile. "Any regrets?" he asked, his voice deeper than usual. Irene turned around, her eyes reflecting the drifting clouds outside the window. "Daniel might as well donate these shares as compensation rather than let them gather dust in my hands." She smiled. "People should just hold on to their true selves. Too many desires and I'd lose my grip." Daniel suddenly stepped closer, closing the distance between them to mere inches. "Irene," he began, his tone unusually serious, "after we return from Africa, would you consider being my girlfriend?" Irene paused for a moment. Assistant Daniel, haste makes waste. She took half a step back, lifting her already packed suitcase. "Ask me that again when we get back." With that, she wheeled her luggage toward the door, turning back at the entryway. "Hurry up or we'll miss our flight." He chuckled softly. This chase, he was willing to wait. The end.